So Michael's professor and chair of public policy and public affairs at UMass Boston. And his research includes work in decision modeling for nonprofits and government agencies. So he's done research on things ranging from affordable housing to community development, work related to urban climate change adaptation, and as we'll hear today, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So he's founding chair of the Informs Committee on DEI, and he's a founding member of the Informs Pro Bono Analytics program. And so Michael's part of our IEMS advisory board. He's got a BS from Morehouse College, and his PhD is from right here, from IEMS. I think his dissertation involved optimization modeling for locating subsidized housing in metro areas. And so Michael's been doing work in this area for quite some time. And so I think our plan is the following. So as you all know, we asked you to do homework before this seminar. So Michael had an Informs tutorial, and we shared the link on that. And I think our plan is that Michael will start by kind of summarizing that tutorial and the related research agenda. And then we'll have a moderated discussion, and Karen's going to help serve as the moderator with that. So to the extent we can welcome you back in this through this mode, it's great to have you here, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and thanks to all of you for taking time to be part of this seminar. I really appreciate you being here. First of all, can you see and hear me okay? Great. So Karen and I worked out this plan where I'll talk for as little as possible, maybe 20 to 25 minutes. And then she and I will have a conversation. Karen, was there anyone else who was going to be part of the conversation with us, or mostly just you?
Everyone here, all the participants.
Yeah. Okay. And during the talk, you're welcome to interject or to interrupt or to redirect, raise your hand, or put it in the chat, or just yell. All of that is fine with me. So let me share my screen. And so I realized that a lot of what I'll talk about will be familiar to you, and so I'll try to get to the good stuff as soon as I can. So we're going to start with this policy motivation, the description of the project as I've conceived it. This notion that we can ask some questions about the work world, the profession, and then other questions about the research world, what I call the discipline. Some practical strategies for enhancing our OR analytics world through DEI, and some discussion and then some references. And most of us, I think, are familiar with certain sort of stylized facts. I think it was President Obama who said in 60 Minutes on Sunday, which I didn't see, that he characterized America as an experiment in a multiracial democracy, and the jury was out on whether it was going to be successful. And that characterization has really struck with me, that we shouldn't take for granted how difficult it is to recognize and manage, work with, and respond to a population, many communities that are diverse in many different ways, where this diversity is not an accident, but a consequence of choices and actions from the very earliest days of this country. There's always a role for this field that we love, but maybe opportunities to do things that many of us in engineering are not as well trained to think about, structural inequalities, and that there's some evidence that the profession is not as reflective of or accommodating of needs and values and perspectives of traditionally or historically underrepresented groups. So I think this is pretty familiar to all of us. So if we wanted to address this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion with OR analytics, I could see three ways that I'll elaborate on a little later. Examine the amount of the nature of underrepresentation in education and work. Think about ways to infuse diversity-related concerns into our research, teaching, service, and recognize these very unengineering words of values and justice to strengthen participation and sense of ownership and impact. And so at the bottom is my little charge, my call to action, which is, borrowed probably 90% from other fields that have had similar recognitions that their impact can be broadened, can be deepened, can be amplified by recognizing voices and experience of historically disadvantaged groups and putting them at the center of their work. So that's my sort of marching orders. And the goal of this project, which really started, probably around 2016, I think. I don't know when Black Lives Matter became a thing, but it was around 2016 I started to think about this whole diversity thing, what it could mean for OR. And of course, a lot of it came out of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee that I'm doing. So how could we make the profession more equitable, more just, and more welcoming? So that yields these three research questions. How diverse and inclusive is the profession? What role does DEI play in the discipline? And how can research and practice incorporate DEI principles? That's where we start. Any questions, any clarifications? Wonderful. So I have these definitions that I worked out with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of Informs with, I guess, the board of directors. I think they had to sign off on this because this is on the website. And I should say that I went into this project thinking of diversity as one kind of thing, primarily through my personal lens of being African American. And I came out of it having a deep and profound appreciation for the many different ways that our identities influence the way we see the world and interact with the world and make contributions to the world around us. So that's why all these different measures are important. And I've recognized that inclusion is absolutely necessary to make diversity sustainable, and equity is at the center, as I see it, of public policy. So I think, as I said, of dividing the research into the part that's devoted to the profession. And I'd like to learn so much about the Informs membership. We have a small amount of data that helps us capture something about membership as a whole and participation in certain subdivisions, sections, societies, fora. But there's much more that we could learn about Informs in some of these diversity ambassador projects by looking into that. I'd love to ask questions about Informs members, what their experiences in the society, how they've thought about their research enterprise. But for now, the focus is on practitioner-focused initiatives that advance DEI. For the discipline, again, the dream is to do something amazing with content analysis and data science that could tell a really compelling story about what DEI means, where into the literature, where it occurs. But for now, at least I can answer some questions for literature that I and colleagues have been able to identify that has what we understand to be a connection to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What's that literature look like? Where is it published? What does it talk about? And if we wanted to propose ways that our profession, our discipline, the methods we use and the work we do could be enriched in order to address DEI, what would those look like? So what we know from the profession is that there's been a lack of enthusiasm about INFORMS' commitment to diversity. This came out in the 2016 member survey, and the numbers for Black members were brutal, like 0% agreeing with certain statements. I worked with the INFORMS office to get member data, and after doing some magic to impute numbers, because amazingly, many of our members don't want to indicate what gender they are or what race, ethnicity group they fall in. I found out that Blacks and Hispanics together comprise less than 10% of the membership, and that the membership is about 22% female. One thing that's interesting is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines all these different professions in the US. So there's this profession called Operations Research Analyst. And a majority of the Americans who work in this profession, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, are female. So this operations research analyst looks a lot more like the general workforce than it does STEM. So there's a funded study that's been going on for a few years by Aaron Check of University of Michigan and John Watsunis of Temple that looked at a broad range of professional societies in STEM, did surveys that were statistically pretty robust, posed and got responses to a lot of questions related to workplace bias, incivility, and so forth. And so they found that we have issues in INFORMS. Marginalization, devaluation, negative experiences according to race and gender. And what's amazing is that the university respondents said indicated worse conditions than those in the private sector. This chart is only supposed to indicate that given the underrepresentation of women and Blacks and Hispanics in INFORMS, according to a small and unrepresentative sample of subdivisions data, women appear to be overrepresented, that is, comprising membership of sections of societies, et cetera, 20% above their representation in the society as a whole for a bunch of subdivisions we looked at. And Hispanics and Blacks tended to be underrepresented, even compared to the very low baseline numbers we have. So this is just some evidence that maybe INFORMS has some work to do. And
Michael,
yes,
can we interrupt?
Please.
Can you, in the previous slide, can you tell us how you chose these sections? How did you? Because I can tell you optimization and computing society is going to look very different then.
Right. How did I don't remember. I mean, I know that for the fora, there are only 4 of them. Mm-hmm. And sort of that's where we start when talking about diversity.
Yeah, I mean, the overrepresentation of women, obviously in women in RMS and some of these more women-oriented topics, I think, might be misleading. So I understand.
Yeah, I understand very well that for affiliation groups, we should put issues of representation to the side. I'm talking about the non-affiliation groups, organization science, social media analytics, information systems, and so forth. This was not a random representative sample. And I'd have to go back to Gina Lloyd, who works in the Informs office. I think she got these, we only got one chapter, and we know that there are like 30, 40 domestic and international chapters. So I'd have to get back to you on how we chose these. But your personal experience is a little different, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how?
Yeah, there are some. So I mean, I would be very interested to know optimization and computing societies.
Okay.
Or
well,
applied probability, let's say. Or
can I ask you to put that in the chat, please?
Yeah,
because,
sure.
Because we're going to record all this, and
sure.
it would be great for me to follow up later. So that's one of the big plans I have with my doctoral student, is to get information about all sections, all societies, all fora, all chapters. But we're not close to that yet. So this is just supposed to indicate that there may be evidence of something that needs to get fixed. And other societies have recognized similar problems. The computer scientists, the economists, finance, urban planning have all in different ways come to understand that issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are not cosmetic. It's not about just enlarging the on-ramp, that these problems go deep and that they require real attention. So let me say more about what I call the discipline. And some of you have probably heard me talk about this notion of engineering itself being a barrier to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I guess I have personal experience, since that was my training at Georgia Tech. Of course, Georgia Tech is a very different place these days. But I really resonated with the paper by Sarah et al. That said that engineering builds a worldview, that there's this notion that technical correctness is more important than anything, that any concern with diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera, is political, that it diverts from our essential focus on meritocracy, and that engineers are trained to believe that, that the real work is in the numbers, anything else detracts from it, and diversity is a synonym for favoritism, bias, and lower standards. And it all rides on what we do, like it's the problem sets and nothing else. This is one group of researchers' view, and I'm not endorsing it as an indictment. I'm not using this to indict the entire engineering profession, but to say that this is one view that is could be useful for us. It's also, I think, good to understand why we do what we do, how we know what we know, the relationships that we build, how we solve problems, how we design interventions, that our approaches may embody some of the values that we have assimilated in our trainings, and which we may in turn transmit to our students. And so I like the idea of asking, who are we developing models for and with, and what purpose should the models be put? So for those of you who've seen the presentation, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these categories, but starting with the editor's cut in 2018, I worked with a doctoral student and Anahita Kojandi in the DEI committee on a range of categories for making sense of research that we thought might be connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these are workplace diversity, workplace inclusion, diversity inclusion for development, sustainability, and resiliency, et cetera. So these categories are not fixed in stone. I've known for a while that I really want to revisit these. I want to develop a sort of more robust theory about it, but still, I was able to find lots of really exciting examples of diversity-related work in the literature. And you can see sort of the topic areas on the screen. Effects of identity on work outcomes, differential levels of funding for startups based on entrepreneur race. This was in management science. Amazingly, Black entrepreneurs get less money than white entrepreneurs for exactly the same work. This is something that we see in many other domains. There's a lot of work in DEI related to making communities more sustainable. And some of you who know, Andy Trapp is at Worcester Polytech. I've met him, he's wonderful. And I think his paper on refugee resettlement will come out soon. An outstanding example to me of DEI work. And lots of examples in higher education as well, designing work groups, evaluating peer feedback. The professional culture of DEI, there's lots of lab experiments on gender differences and competition and career outcomes, how to make diversity and equity sustainable. There's actually papers on designing affirmative action programs for admissions, optimization modeling, design pay raise schemes to increase equity. And the final category is analytic methods to support DEI research and practice. And this is a category, it's like a grab bag that covers all the things that we read before and trying to make sense of it all. And so coming into this project, you know, I'm in the Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs. I've been in public policy my whole career. So I'm always around social scientists. And I'm very familiar with, very comfortable with a social science way of understanding the world. I was very surprised, very taken aback that many of the papers that I read in informs journals like Organization Science seemed to me to be not much different in terms of application area, methodology, motivation, and impacts than what you would find in papers in Academy of Management or Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. So there's lots of room for social science-based methods. But where we talk about, you know, work that that intends to focus on predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, I see a distinction between CRISP problems, the ones that are straightforward to formulate and design, and ones that are a little messier, multiple stakeholders and community engagement. And it's the center category, of course, that I see as the center of what programs like IEMS teach, but please feel free to correct me, and somewhat less emphasis on the top and bottom categories. Okay, so what do we learn? That diversity can and should be construed really broadly. And we can learn about groups that may not be diverse and use our understanding about a range of work groups and organizations to develop rationales for policy and administrative interventions. And that our analytics really can generate specific prescriptions to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the papers that I read, and I'm not making any claims for a comprehensive view of the literature, but it was the best that I knew of at the time, seemed to be mostly about org design and management. And the most highly represented informs journal was it Organization Science? Yeah. There's lots of non-informs journals that have a presence in the field. I saw lots of papers from European Journal of OR, Socioeconomic Planning Sciences, Journal of Operational Research Society, Capital Management, etc. So this is a domain that I would say within informs has room for growth. So there's lots of things that I didn't find. Very few papers written by researchers that I could identify as Black or Latinx or LGBT. Very few papers that addressed social settings in which issues or concerns of communities of color or LGBT persons have a substantial presence. In other words, not a lot of papers about me or us or my community. And very few papers that I saw that tended to support interventions that address structural and historical discrimination and bias. I'm going to stop here. I have another section, but this is the research part, and you may have experiences and perspectives that differ. comments or questions about any of this? Okay, great. Let me continue.
So in AI, there's this fairness in AI that is the big buzz. In artificial intelligence, fairness, and do you see connections with that type of research? Or?
Yes, very much. I've had to, broaden my understanding of what OR and analytics is. This is a topic that I think will come up later. Traditional OR, classic OR, and what we can make of data science and artificial intelligence. But my understanding is that yes, in computational sciences, especially in AI, there is a pretty robust understanding that algorithmic bias is real, it's very socially consequential, and we need to take it really seriously. Okay, so what can we do about helping our profession grow in ways that accommodate notions of DEI? So there are many papers that I can highlight. One of them is in a special issue of European Journal of OR that I co-edited on community-based OR by Thorsten and McGarvey on a scheme for providing mobile dental services to meet needs of a chronically underserved population, where the findings are that on efficiency measures alone, you can't do it. But if your goal is social justice, there are lots of opportunities to design promising interventions. So this is something, this is an example of taking social justice seriously as a rationale for doing a study and for framing the results of it in terms that might be slightly different than what engineers might be traditionally familiar with. A student whose dissertation I researched was looking at the building marketplaces for legalized marijuana cannabis in Massachusetts. And the analytics connection is where are the communities that have been most harmed through the previous criminalization regime that targeted people in communities of color for possession and sale of marijuana. And the idea is that the more we know about where these communities are, the better we will be able to target social supports and interventions of various kinds. This is straight up analytics. There are lots of other applications of DEI, disaster response, staff scheduling. I want to focus on homeless and slum services. So the idea is that there are ways to apply problem structuring methods to better understand needs and concerns of severely disadvantaged or populations or communities without voice in order to design interventions. And this requires that you engage these populations directly. This is not something that we often see in our field. So there's lots of opportunity, there's lots of initiatives in Informs to promote DEI, and I'm amazed by all this work. Many of you probably know about the work of Ken Chelst to do work in K-12. It used to be that for every conference, Ken would engage with the school teachers in that city well before the start of the conference and have tutorials and teach-ins on operations research. He's done a tremendous job of enlarging the pipeline and interest of students. Management Science came out with a virtual special issue on DEI. It's like an editor's cut. It's stuff that they've already published, but they put it out there. Doing good with good OR, mostly healthcare or interventions in developing countries. There's a lot more that I think doing good with good OR could do, but it's a very promising first step. Other organizations have pursued strategies to engage members of disadvantaged or marginalized or less influential communities. And the Urban Research-Based Action Network that I'm a part of tries to rethink how researchers can engage with communities. And at the bottom is advice, kinds of things I'm dealing with pro bono analytics. to enable folks who want to do the work to figure out how you would get started. And my short conclusion is talk. Do a lot of listening and a little bit of talking with local organizations. Wow. The engineering profession has a little work to do. Informs has a little work to do. If it's true that DEI research is disproportionately represented in social science affiliated subfields and there are opportunities to broaden our focus, our reach, it seems to me that there really is opportunities to do OR analytics work that reflects needs of communities of color and other marginalized groups. It'll come out in the discussion. There are a number of researchers who are doing great work in this area already, but I'm saying from the stuff that I did in my editor's cut, surely future research is going to have a broader and more comprehensive view of the literature. What can we do? Make it part of our mission statement. Identify norms and values that marginalize underrepresented groups. This is the notion of anti-racist pedagogy. Think about new kinds of problems we could address, work across disciplinary boundaries, include the community in identifying, formulating, solving problems, implementing solutions, and recognize that diversity and excellence can be mutually reinforcing. Some of the diversity folks have this phrase called diverse excellence. I hope it's more than PR. So these are the circle things are the ones that I feel particularly strongly about. So I have a larger agenda. And I'm working with a guy, that former student who's a research professor at University of Michigan. We'd like to expand our analysis of informed membership. We'd like to do a real sort of high quality job of looking at the OR and literature, basically generalizing content analysis with data science to look at lots of papers, including those that may not appear on the surface to have any connection with DEI, in order to understand where the opportunities and pressure points are. I'd like to look at education programs. What is special about different programs like IEMS for undergraduates and graduates? I'd like to develop a roadmap for DEI-informed research design. How can we conceive of research initiatives that aspire to make a difference and going beyond DEI? So I wanted to just share a bunch of resources. All these people, as they say, they take credit for the good stuff and they don't take credit for the mistakes, but I've depended on so many people over these years. And here's some resources from other professional societies, and you may be familiar with these: the American Mathematical Society, Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, American Economics Association, and some references that I think are mostly in the paper that I sent. So I'd like to stop here, turn off the screen share. And Karen, how would you like to proceed?
So maybe I'll start with a couple of the questions that you and I talked about, kind of leading the discussion, and then open up to questions from the audience. You can also put questions in the chat, if that sounds good. Great. So as you move forward with this research agenda in DEI, in OR and analytics, I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on what changes we need, both in the training of graduate students and faculty, and also in the evaluation of graduate students.
Well, so I came up through a dual degree program. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's where you spend 3+ years at a liberal arts school and then 2+ years at an engineering school. And I did it because I just didn't see myself doing 4 years of engineering and taking like 3 liberal arts courses. It just wasn't my thing. But the dual degree program was probably the best thing that could have happened to me, because it gave me from the very beginning an exposure to liberal arts, humanities, applied social sciences, an ethic of engaging with the community at Morehouse that was different than the ethic that I learned at Georgia Tech. My older son is doing computer engineering at UMass Amherst. It wouldn't have been my first choice. If you're going to pick a really hard major, pick computer engineering. Well, that's what he's doing. And because of that, the credits that he would have transferred from community college made him a transfer sophomore at Amherst, whereas I've been doing liberal arts, he would have been a transfer junior or more. So there are real costs to a recommendation like engineering students should take more liberal arts. But I also think that by the time engineering students may get exposure to public policy, social policy issues through senior design courses and the like, you know, the cake has been baked already in terms of a lot of their understanding of the world. So it'd be really great for undergraduates to get more exposure to this kind of stuff early. For graduate students, maybe if they're required to do concentrations, I think my concentrations were economics with Art Herder, decision analysis, maybe something else. Maybe one concentration area could come outside of the department or even outside of the college. We can encourage dissertation committees to have faculty outside the department or the college. In my department, we require every dissertation committee to have one external member who's not in the department or directly affiliated with the PhD program. So there's this question about how we recruit doctoral students and what we expect them to do. And I fear that there may be an arms race for doctoral students, where the question is, how do we tell apart the 20 applicants with perfect GRE scores and 5 published papers for entry into a doctoral program? I'm exaggerating, of course, but the point is that if we want doctoral programs to adhere more to an apprenticeship model where students learn how to become scholars, as opposed to a credentialing model and a professional assistance model where faculty recruit the students who are already positioned to do elite research. Well, if these models have any merit, if they align at all with your experience, then maybe it's possible to think of an alternative approach for recruiting and training up our graduate students.
Right, because the community, a lot of the things that you talked about, engaging the community, putting community at the center of the problem that you're defining, they take time. So how do we, with the tenure track process and speed and emphasis and publications taking so long, how do we get that time?
Yeah. So I think, didn't Northwestern, like many other schools, delay the tenure clock for everybody?
With COVID?
This past year? Yeah. Yeah. So we had it on our campus, and I think it was an opt-in, not an opt-out, but I think most people opted in. So COVID is kind of reminding me that things that used to take an act of Congress may not in the future. Even something as fundamental as the length of the tenure track. You know, when your house is on fire, you're like, oh, we got to do something. So, what could it be? So at our university, we have these online annual faculty reports to write down all the awesome things we did during the year. And, you know, it took a lot of bureaucracy in order for the provost's office to allow respondents, faculty respondents, to note in a separate area, not part of their intellectual accomplishments, etc., the work they did in community engaged research, right? So even to just document what you did, not making it a part of a formal part of your portfolio, took a lot of change. But at least it's a start. If you can, I'm sorry, I'm taking a deep breath because, I love my time at Carnegie Mellon, but it was also true that I was on the DL when it came to a lot of my community work. I love this community planning process I did for a neighborhood that I work with, but I didn't put it on my annual report because it was just clear that community engaged work, qualitative work, it wasn't valued. In fact, it was a detriment. It was going to take you away from the stuff that you knew you had to do to publish. So I have a slightly different take. I mean, the tenure track thing is huge and it's really complicated. I'm going to focus on something else, and that is how we get people from underrepresented groups onto the tenure track in a way that supports their success. And this is different from opportunity hires, poaching the most outstanding Black or brown person you see, et cetera. But maybe developing sort of different on-ramps so that promising graduates can do postdocs or other kinds of employment affiliations at universities with a realistic shot at the tenure track, so that we get more than one at a time of really outstanding emerging scholars who are building their portfolios with a belief and expectation that the place they're at values their work and would want to engage with them for the long term. I guess if I was going to be radical, if it's what you value, you got to spend money. You got to spend time. You got to spend prestige. And some people with privilege are going to take it. Right? So I'm just going to put it out there. If it matters to you about emerging faculty of color, being able to establish research agendas in ways that do not always align with the salami model of volume first, and of course, quality, but counting papers, then maybe there needs to be a way to allow more time on the tenure track for certain faculty whose success we believe is essential to the long-term health of our university and the way that it engages and represents our communities. There, provost, do something with it.
I like that quote, if you value something, spend money. So I have more questions, but I also want to see if anyone from the audience wants to jump in with questions.
So, I mean, one comment is the mission statements, right? Right now, we're in the mission statement update phase of the diversity and inclusion. Everybody's updating their mission statements. But, how does that help if the culture and the environment does not change?
Don't do a mission statement. No, what I mean is, I'm a little cynical. So it turns out my wife is must be the curse of Black professionals. My wife has been working for a state agency for a while, and she runs the Black Managers Committee. I'm co-president of Black Faculty, Staff, and Student Association. Eventually, when you're in this business long enough, you start to look around and say, hey, I need to do something about this. So we're both passionate about it. We're both committed to it, but we're both incredibly cynical as well. And I'm just going to say that if you have a way that you're operating over here, and there's a statement that you're trying to make that is, let us say, 100% aspirational, I think I'd put the statement down and ask, what do we recognize about this thing that we're doing? And are we willing to have difficult conversations about what we could be that might be different in fundamental ways from what we are now. Who wants to spend all afternoon in a retreat? Worse, a virtual retreat, talking about diversity mission statements if everyone knows that it's a kabuki game? Not me.
No, I say it because there was a talk recently, about a month ago at Northwestern, and I have to look up my notes to see, there's a book on this as well, research on this, where university updated their mission statement and attracted all these diverse people. But once they reached that location, they just fled basically because the environment has not changed. So I think it's aspirationally, it's great, but how do we change the culture beyond the statements?
Well, I think I want to recalibrate a bit. What I mean is, I want to give all of us, I want to give all of us credit for wanting to imagine a different world, and for deciding that we want our work in some way, whether it's the teaching or the research or the community or professional service, to play a substantive and non-trivial role in making this better world come about. I think if we want to say to ourselves and to our colleagues, yes, this is really important, and what can we do to make this come about? So I want to start there. I want people to understand that it is okay to recognize that where we are is not where we want to be. Who we are now is not who we wish to be in the future. And then ask ourselves, what would it take to get there? And maybe there are some kinds of actions that are big and consequential, and other ones that are maybe not so much. So I think, for example, of the Teaching Effectiveness Colloquium that I attended on last Saturday for the Informs Conference. So me and Julie Ivey and Ruben Peranio, who runs the Minority Issues Forum, and Susan Martinos, who's a current chair of the Safety Inclusion Committee, we formed a panel to talk about DEI in the profession. And so one of the seminars they had before then was these two instructors that Susan Martinosi knew, who talked about anti-racist pedagogy in STEM. One of them, I think, is a chemistry professor. And, with their permission, I'm sure I could share the presentation with you. But the point was that there are very specific ways that our teaching can be changed to identify, to change practices that are exclusionary or not reflective of student experiences from underrepresented groups. Ways that we can ensure that all students know that they belong and that their contributions are valued. In other words, ways to teach that go beyond a certain kind of viewpoint of what good student participation is, what it looks like, what it sounds like, and doing work that doesn't, that is not perceived by underrepresented students as devaluing their experiences or making it harder for them. So these are examples of things that are not, I think, quite so big and imposing, because they allow us potentially the space to say, how could I do my classroom teaching just a little bit different? How could I re-envision my syllabus? Not like a mandate from home. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think as you also said, we do need to talk about action items beyond the aspirations. And
so hi, Michael, I have
so one thing that, please, Jorge.
No, I didn't want to interrupt your. Okay, hello, Michael. Can you hear me?
Please.
Okay, how are you?
Wow.
I watched your tutorials and something I'm interested in watching and understanding, what are the trends? How are things changing with time? Now, you probably know Richard Tapia, who's been working on this topic for 30 years, right? So by observing him, I see what the trends are. You don't have to answer here, but you can just point me to places. But there was one of the graphs where you showed that Asians were reporting having to work harder than others to be recognized. Is this new? Is this something that's happened in the last 10 years? And I suppose there are other trends like, what are the number of women in OR? I suppose they have increased, but I don't know the numbers. Is there historical data that you have?
No, I hate to sound so definitive, but what I mean to say is I have no historical data that will allow me to say here how the demography of informs or of peer societies to informs have changed over time. I've been a long time informs member, but I can't tell you whether the organization has had better gender representation, better representation of Blacks and Hispanics now than 10, 20, 30 years ago. My inclination would be to say yes, because I see more Black and Hispanic colleagues. Minority Issues Forum is bigger now than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Many of the colleagues I know in MIF are taking senior positions at their institutions. But I don't know how much of that is mentioned.
Okay, thanks.
My next question actually kind of gets into Jorge's question as well. Like, so you said, in 2016, you started working on these, the Informs DEI, and I'm wondering what your impression is of how conversations have changed this year. There's certainly, Jorge mentioned Richard Tapia, he gave a plenary. Do you feel like things are changing in Informs in terms of the way we discuss DEI, the way new initiatives, are there departments or initiatives that you say, that's great, we need to spread this more? Or are there certain areas where you're seeing pushback?
Well, it always helps to have friends in high places. And Pinar Kiskinacek is a valued colleague, someone that I've known for a long time, and a wonderful person. And she is the brains behind the operation for diversity ambassadors. She got it funding, and every year for some years to come, there'll be a cadre of Informs members with great ideas about how to make the society more welcoming, more inclusive through applied research, novel ideas for practice. And so that kind of energy can't be overstated. And my relationship with the previous president, Brian Denton, has been equally positive. He's been just a valued collaborator behind the scenes, validating lots of things that we're doing. But there's, I think, another thing that the society has done is, for example, in diversity statements. So around the time of the George Floyd murder, many organizations were making statements. It was like a cottage industry. Everyone had a statement. Well, I learned from our current executive director that she was particularly impressed by the quality of Informs' statement because it spoke to institutional and historical racism and the need to act in very specific ways to address these barriers. So I have to admit, at the time, I thought the statement was maybe not as strong as it could have been. But our executive director, Lena Gersman is her name, she said that compared to other professional societies we knew, Informs was really progressive. was really sort of committing to naming the problem and wanting to do something about it. So that counts for something. But I also know that I think in the mainstream of the organization, the people who are doing the work in different societies and sections and so forth, I think diversity is not top of list for many of their concerns. And I think that diversity is probably seen by them as primarily an issue of representation and not as much on what we can study or what we can learn. I think it would be great if there was this increased awareness of increasing diversity of society, but also increasing diversity of the discipline, of the questions we ask, of the methods we use. So I want to mention one other thing, actually. This has to do with some of the pushback. So most of the people I know are nice enough not to push back to my face. Thank you very much. But it's there, nevertheless. Too much focus on social justice. You know, I'm not a racist. What about diversity of thought? This whole operations research analyst, that's not who we are. They don't have doctorates. There's more.
We have another question in the chat. Dave, do you have time for another question?
Sure. Why don't we do one more and then we can wrap up maybe?
Yes, please.
So the question in the chat is from one of our PhD students. What would be the role of journals or editorial teams in promoting the change? Is there a role for them, and how can this be coordinated without bias?
Well, hey, we have somebody looking at that. Is it Margaret Brando, who's doing one of the diversity ambassador projects, looking at the makeup of editorial boards? So editorial boards, prize committees, nominating committees, that's like the final frontier of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those entities, those organizations are the real gatekeepers. They are those who maintain, who set, codify, and maintain the standards of excellence for our organization, right? If you want to get into a fight, talk about what the editorial board for management science should or should not be doing. So I think, the energy will have to come from the top to editorial boards to say, you need to take representation seriously, representation of bodies on the board, and representation of topic areas seriously. You'll have to broaden your conception of what counts. So some of you may remember from a long time, 2009, there was an article in ORMS Today about soft OR. It's my thing, so I pay attention to stuff like that. And it was signed by probably 20 or 30 of the top soft OR scholars around the world, mostly in the UK. They say soft OR is great, we do all these problems, et cetera, et cetera. Why won't you be friends with us? That's not friends. But we got it. There was a response. And the response was from the then editor of Operations Research. And that editor said, our journal is about math models. If you got math models, we'll consider them. If you don't, go someplace else. Well, I think that's an example of an editorial mindset that, if evolved, could make more space for diversity on editorial boards and changes in the nature of the work that editorial boards decide is publishable quality.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, thank you very much. We're really grateful for your time, your insights, for both thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation and discussion. So.
Yeah, thank you, David, so much.
Thank
This is
you.
what I learned from Informed, is to unmute so everyone can clap. That was my
Oh,
take.
I like that. I like that. I
If
like
people
that.
want to unmute to clap, you can do that.
Yeah. Hey, that's really nice.